Okay, and I shall share the screen. Oh, they changed the app, I think. I have a new version of the plugin. Where is it? Google Chrome. I think this is it here. Okay, can everyone see that? Nothing compromising?
Looks good.
All right, so what I mean by that is proprietary information. There we go. Let's see here. And I am now going to, oh, have I actually already started the recording? Sorry. Pause record. Okay, so welcome everyone to the January 28th iteration of the MicroProfile Live Hangout. This is considered kind of the off week for the Live Hangout where we cover special topics. This week we are continuing the discussion of the MicroProfile working group kind of approaches to solutions. So I threw an idea out, so the screen's being shared. I threw an idea out based on what David did. So David posted something to the MicroProfile Google group about kind of going over, you know, when MicroProfile was founded, what was the intent, right? And then he followed that up with a couple of approaches. This is again around more technical alignment right now, as opposed to where does MicroProfile fall in terms of working groups? Because this is a problem that'll have to be solved no matter what. So maybe we look at this problem first around spec alignment. And then I added one that basically says maybe MicroProfile doesn't need to be a platform. Maybe it's just a collection of specs like RFCs. This is an idea I've been chatting around a little bit, and even had a brief conversation with Ariane on in the working group thread in the Google groups. So David's not here. Out of curiosity, how many folks have actually had a chance to read his? I was gonna do I don't know if I can do a poll. I've never done a poll. Sorry, this is a live poll here. Maybe add a question. Oh, never mind. It's too complex without having done this ahead of time. I guess a verbal cue. How many folks have actually had a chance to read David's pull request to the sandbox that I kind of linked in the notes?
I did.
Others?
I read, but not full. Haven't finished it.
Yeah, I read it too.
Okay, so it sounds like a decent number of folks have read it.
Good. John, just as a quick poll, because some people may not be able to cut in, you can just click yes or no on the participants list.
Oh, that's an idea.
So you did a verbal question and people can do yes or no. So.
The chat, sorry, I'm looking for manage participants.
Yeah, if you just go to that, yeah, to the participants, and then that near the bottom there, you should see a yes, no, go slower, go faster.
Oh yeah, okay. Oh, awesome. Good idea, Kevin, thanks. So yeah, a yes if you've read it, and no if you have not. Or at least you have a decent idea of what it is. Maybe you haven't read like every single bullet. Okay, so most people have. Excellent. So maybe what I'll do is briefly pull these up. So David is traveling today, so was unable to make it. So this is the Google group where he, discusses the actual options, which I actually plan to reply to. One is, sorry, I'm looking for the actual. I thought I pulled it up. Innovations. There's one more I missed. To frame up, here we go. To frame up the conversation. So this is basically talked about the original intent of MicroProfile circa 2016. So basically 4 years ago. And so if you've had a chance, there's, various folks, some are on this call have provided, although mine was not made in 2019, that's 2017. These are various conversations, and the overall idea is that we come up with specifications in MicroProfile, and that when they mature, maybe they move on to a standards organization. We never, by design, defined what that standards organization would be, right? At the time, this is when, we kind of did this outside of the JCP. It could have been the JCP. We even submitted a config JSR via the JCP, but it could have been potentially other organizations as well, right? So that's kind of a little bit of the background. The next one is innovations graduate into Jakarta. So this means, if this continues on with that original idea being innovations graduate to Jakarta. So once a spec becomes mature, I guess, the idea is maybe it gets taken, moved, whatever the right word, or submitted as, a spec in some other place. It could be Jakarta, I guess. It's, they're both, Eclipse projects. And he has a list of pros and cons with that. And then the last one is it remains its own standard initiative. Sorry, Kevin.
Yeah, John. Man, you are good at detecting my voice. So that first bullet right there on your page there, that's not a requirement that it has to be repackaged into the Jakarta namespace.
Right.
That it could be proposed that way, but it would not have to be.
And it would not be a good thing to repackage it as we move forward to standards or a final version of it, because then everyone has a breaking change and everyone needs to adopt their programs.
Yeah, I mean, look at the issue that we're having with the Java X2 Jakarta.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, kind of the existing example, or one that Java EE had, is it used, a Corba namespace, right, for Corba-related things when it was founded. So, how important is it that everything that Jakarta does has to be in the Jakarta namespace, right? So if it wants to adopt specifications out of, or packages, whatever, right? I'm just thinking these are not necessarily the best examples, right? Whether it's something out of Apache, something out of the Linux Foundation, whatever, right? Just that's not the one I had in mind. But right, if there's things that are being pulled in from somewhere, maybe to CNCF, maybe, right? Maybe there's something like, Kubernetes related that is decided to kind of be consumed. Do they all have to fall under the Jakarta namespace? So this is one of the questions. So maybe we'll just hang here for a while, and maybe we'll just talk through some of the bullets and see if anyone has any additional comments, pros and cons. And what we could do is add that to the meeting notes and then go back and update this via pull request.
Well, somewhere, in one of these documents anyway, David kind of posted the initial question as to what are people's thoughts. Do they consider MicroProfile to be a standards body? Do they consider Jakarta EE to be a standards body? And I think that's kind of a basic question. Because I think that forms the direction of this conversation as far as what are people's current thoughts. I mean, I know what we had, there was the quotes and stuff that you put down, when we started in 2016 and 17 and what our initial thoughts were. But what do other people think that have just come on board with MicroProfile since that time, do they consider MicroProfile to be a standard and they don't expect it to change? Or is it still, you know, pretty fluid like our original ideas? Any comments on that from anybody?
Okay, I'll put it. Oh, someone.
Yeah, it's Ivar here, right?
Oh, hey, Ivar.
Hi. I think I would look at MicroProfile as a standard in a way of portability. So I could write it once and then move it between implementations, but not necessarily in the sense of backwards compatibility. But then again, that's not really what a standard is anyway. That's kind of if a standard wants to be backwards compatible or not. It's so yeah. I think it is a standard, even if it's a fluent standard.
Sorry, before.
Yeah, I think that's the key issue that's still not being discussed is what exactly is the relationship between, because again, the way that the CN4J was proposed is that it really was for any number or any set of cloud native application server-side Java. So more generally, I think we have to have a central runtime or core that would have to be EE. And then the issue is what's the relationship between it and other subgroups of specifications. I mean, that's how I'm looking at this. And I mean, frankly, that's what MicroProfile was. We had a core based on lightweight subset of EE, and then it evolved from what we saw as relevant to microservices development. So to me, that's a discussion that needs to be had and it is related to this promotion of specifications. You know, do things feed into defining multiple platforms around different subset of specs with an EE core? Are there different EE platforms, etc.?
Yeah, so the core 4 specs, you know, the way I'd always looked at them were that they define the programming model, right? At the absolute, you know, kind of like the lowest layer upon which other specs can layer on top of, right? So the other specs couldn't necessarily go and pull in other things outside of the core model, right? So that defined the dependency relationship. So that's what I mean by programming model. So in the way, it's interesting that I've actually never seen MicroProfile really as a standards organization. I think Kevin and I even had this call on one of the live Hangouts, right? Had this discussion where, you know, and there may not be agreement, and that's okay. So where I've never really seen it as a standards organization, but we do create specs, right? And yeah, there's portability, but I've always seen ourselves as an open source project that creates specs, right? As opposed to a standards organization. So.
Yeah, I normally call it de facto standard. Even though we haven't got stamp or standard, however, we have so many implementations. As Eva said, it's kind of we do interoperability and etc. Even if it's not a standard, it's a de facto standard. And the other, this is nicely feeding to David his question about MicroProfile. Do we want to be a standard a body and etc. I think that's kind of feeding nicely. We can discuss like if we become a standard, how can we become a lightweight standard? And the other thing that I don't believe standard has to be carry the label no backward incompatible changes allowed. I don't think that's a requirement for standard.
I think also one of the reasons why I feel it as a standard is that it's so tightly coupled with Java EE or Jakarta EE. So you have this core and you're used to seeing these specifications as a standard. And when MicroProfile kind of has the same triad of TCK and implementation and the specification, it kind of the community or we as consumers of this, we see it as a standard, even though you don't mean it to be a standard.
Yeah, but what do we mean when we say standards? Because I'm not clear. I mean, standards historically do not deal with backwards compatibility. To me, the bigger issue is EE has a set of enterprise customers that have expectations and support life cycles that are non-trivial. I mean, that's generally what vendors in that space have to deal with, and that's what they get paid for. So to me, the issue is, what are the requirements of enterprise customers, and how do these various other specifications relate to that, and how do we see those being involved, move forward? And I mean, part of this is not really answerable until we deal with, for example, the EE9 transition, and we see, you know, what are they going to be requiring? That's our first real speed bump in terms of having to deal with significant compatibility problems in Java EE and Jakarta EE.
And I'm going to throw one other thing out there, in that I never really wanted MicroProfile to really be tightly coupled to Java EE, Jakarta EE, right? So it defines a similar core programming model. So if it's tightly coupled, that means the place you run MicroProfile is Java EE, Jakarta EE, and that's the only place you can run it, right? The way I look at MicroProfile is, actually the way I look at Java EE, and this is something a slide I created a long time ago. It's not necessarily a platform. How do I say this? Java EE is a platform, but the JCP was a palette of specifications that you could combine into something, which became the Java EE platform, right? And that's how I see MicroProfile, right? Which is, it's a collection of specifications that vendors can choose to pick or not pick up. So Quarkus and Helidon, for instance, and I know Bill's on the call, and I don't mean to speak for Oracle in any way, but the way that I've seen them both so far is that there's no intent for either one of those to be Java EE compatible, what I can see, right? I can say that for Quarkus, not entirely for Helidon, right? They are MP compatible, but they also pull in technologies that are from outside of Java EE as well, right? So what I see is a collection of specifications, a palette to pick from, upon which runtimes can choose and decide. Now, that does impact things like portability that Ivar mentioned, right? Or Ivar, sorry, mentioned. But it's just a different way of looking at the problem, I guess. I'll stop.
If what makes a collection of specs standards? What is the criteria? Because a standard, for me, that's a bit, yeah, it's a term, but what does it actually mean? What are the consequences if you call yourself a standard? That's not clear for me, at least not in the context of programming thing.
Yeah.
Agreed. That's the point. I don't think that's clear at all. It doesn't mean anything, frankly. So that is the crux of this issue, is what are you defining? And again, the only way I see it definable is with respect to some subset of core Jakarta EE specifications. Because in other words, these are just independent collection of cloud native APIs, which doesn't really mean much other than they have a specific development model, and potentially a given subgroup of specifications has different operating procedures. But in that case, what's the point of a single working group?
So from my understanding, what is the standard? The standard means it needs to be issued, backed by a standard body, like Oasis, like a GCP. That's like Eclipse, Jakarta EE standard body. And then in MicroProfile, we don't have the standard body, so the MicroProfile specifications are not
okay, but
standard.
that's all that is a working group in Jakarta EE.
But Jakarta EE is a standard body as well, right? It's a standard body.
Is Jakarta EE a standards body? Has it claimed itself to be a standards body? I still don't know the answer. It's a,
Well, again, we're getting into what is the semantics of standards.
okay.
I mean, it just, I
Okay.
guess you can claim that it produces version specifications. What else do you need to define a standard?
And hello.
I mean, they all deal with the same subset of problems. IP flow.
Yeah.
You know, again, compatibility is generally not. That is something. I mean, what the JCP and the Jakarta working group has carried over are the unique aspects are that it had a stronger compatibility claim, and it also had specific TCK requirements, which generally standards don't deal with.
The Eclipse Foundation previously didn't have this capability or standard body, so that's why I set up a Jakarta EE specification process. So that's why it can issue standard. MicroProfile hasn't. So MicroProfile by definition is not standard, but it's a kind of de facto standard.
I apologize for interrupting the conversation. All I'm saying, I forgot to mention, taking notes is a shared responsibility for everyone on the call. That's one of the things I normally say, and I forgot. So I'm taking notes, but I'm also, while I'm doing it, it's hard to do both, right? Track the conversation and do both, and kind of moderating the discussion, it's a little bit tough. So if I get a little help taking notes, thanks.
Yeah, so John, I think Cesar was trying to speak up, but he was extremely faint. Cesar, did you have something?
Yeah, do you hear me now? Do you hear me better?
Yes, better.
Yes.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so I think that all this topic about the standards, I think we need to separate what I have here so far. For example, the standard about the organization and all the heavy lifting that a working group or a group of individuals needs to come up. And the other thing is the standard from the point of view of how the industry entitle, I will say it, something as the standard, because that is what most people is using. So I think when I think in MicroProfile, personally speaking, I think that it's not a standard, it's a set of specifications as was already mentioned, but in the way the industry it may be using it is like, okay, that's the reference, that's the standard for cloud native APIs. And I think that has a slightly different treatment dependently of the perspective you're seeing. If you are seeing from the point of view of the industry, or actually how this is being done, like as far as I feel it and I agree, like a set of specifications, and that's it, a sandbox for maturing and giving fast pace of new APIs.
Any other views? And if Cesar, if you could type your comment in the
Sure.
in the notes, that would be awesome.
Sure.
Any other views? Is it important to have this discussion? Is it a standard or not? To have the technical discussion, alignment discussion?
Well, I think the alignment discussion is relevant. I don't know that arguing about whether or not it's a standards body is, though, because to me that I still don't know what a standard is relative to either Jakarta EE or CN4J. I mean, we would have to define what does that mean and what impact does it have on any specification participating in that.
I think we should reach out to Eclipse Foundation to give us kind of definition about the standard. I think it's interesting to level set, so people agree on the things. Basically, we have the common foundation to stand, but we don't need to resolve at this call. And then I think it's even if it's not standard or if it is standard, do we want to be standard, right?
Well, even
but I guess I'm sorry. I would say Scott's point is right. It kind of doesn't matter. What matter more I think now is if the alignment has to be in place or not, regardless if it's a standard or not. So I would second Scott's opinion.
Yeah, because I guess my view is that if we go back to the Eclipse Foundation, they might give us their definition, but like what Scott is indicating, I think everybody has their own definition of what a standard is. And if you went to Oasis and Eclipse and Apache and JCP, they'd all have a little different definition. So maybe it's not coming to a common understanding of what a standard is probably not required.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, the main point of discussion and how a single working group does or doesn't benefit it is what is the relationship between Jakarta EE and MicroProfile and or other future CN4J specification subsets. And that really gets more to the two approaches that David was outlining. I mean, does MicroProfile continue to basically just create independent specifications without regard to its downstream consumers, in particular Jakarta EE? Because again, the way I look at this, CN4J has to have some core runtime. And so the issue is, what is the behavior of various sets of specifications relative to it? And again, it has to map back to enterprise customers. If we're basically restarting and saying enterprise customers, each vendor will deal with them as they deal with them, and we really don't care, that's not part of the charter of a CN4J organization. That's something else. I don't think we're saying that. I think the EE vendors, have commitments to their existing enterprise customers, and it's more a question of how we expand that base with that, as John mentioned, programming API that's understood by them into these newer feature sets and behaviors that they need to deal with in cloud native Java. And there's tons. I mean, Cube is one. I mentioned several when I was trying to bring up this topic in the context of the original discussion. And I mean, this came up in the steering call today too, is there's concern that, without some kind of framing reference, and again, the only thing I see is the Jakarta EE set. I mean, how do you define the scope of CN4J? I mean, in general, that's not a grokkable thing, and I don't see that you would define one working group for that. I mean, frankly, the Cube Foundation, has some of this problem as well, and it just gets to be this massive set of loosely related APIs, and I don't know that I would want that for CN4J.
So when Scott mentioned steering, he's referring to the Jakarta EE steering committee, just an FYI. So that was one of the concerns I've been kind of talking a lot about in the various threads. And even the steering committee is that I am afraid actually that it's going to be a heavily diluted working group if it tries to tackle all sorts of different things. The example I gave, or question I asked really was serverless, right? Should CN4J tackle serverless? And it's like, well, sure, why not? And then it's like, okay, how broad does the scope go? And if the scope goes very broad, then how do you not dilute the focus of any one individual project wants to have, right? As it comes to making decisions that affect everybody. So that's a huge concern that I have. But even then, there's other concerns as well around governance. But this is more technical alignment here, this discussion.
Yeah, but on that topic, okay, maybe you say that there is not a focus anymore, but there can also be some cooperation between things which are more difficult now today because they are in different groups, different set of people which do not know each other, that do not speak to each other. And you bring them together, then you can have something more than just 1 + 1 is not 2, but you end up with something additional, something better.
Yeah, but on that front, to me, the model that best fits that or would allow that to work would be something more along the lines of that incubation notion. So again, take servlet, for example, we've certainly run into problems with trying to adopt and make use of existing EE specifications, security being one of them, because they're making assumptions about the scope of the runtime. So if you had, if the point of CN4J was to find various subsets of specifications that are dealing with, again, microservices is one example of the subset of behaviors, and you took servlets and security, and you could move forward with an EE10 or down the road, and you said, well, we need to be able to partition these such that they're consumable by these other subsets of specifications. We need to modularize them better and allow for that. I mean, I agree that would be the way. But then basically, that getting to my other point, I think you're saying that EE is the core at some level. There's a core EE runtime. Maybe the very minimum being some CDI thing, and then on top of that, you're adding the other feature sets, and then potentially consuming them. But I don't see how. I'm not sure how you would. So either everything becomes flat and you're just adding specifications and you have various profiles, or you have subsets of specifications that are targeting particular things that you don't necessarily want to make a core profile, but you have to have a relationship to it. I mean, that's the thing that I'm still not clear on how we deal with and what's the best way forward with that.
Yeah, and also how you will mature. Let's take the serverless example. How long it will take to mature that, if until a point that you can make it as part of that core, if you don't have it like a sandbox, or what was the term, incubator first, because definitely it's going to require a couple of iterations, right? And there is timing involved in that if you are tied to the release cycle.
Right.
I think it's for this kind of one work group thing. If it's kind of this under this one work group is still the projects are loosely coupled. Don't need to mix them unless it's absolutely necessary. I cannot see the business need and to force like two technology to work and cooperate and etc. It depends if it is one steering committee. However, that steering committee only look after IP logs and all the big decisions to be made by the like a spec, like a work group and etc. This could potentially work. However, if we just force these subgroups to work together, and think I think that's not the way forward. So I don't think that's kind of we should operate in that way either.
Yeah, and in relation, as we say, loosely specs, there is a core. With the MicroProfile, we have just the same. We have a few specs which makes up the umbrella, but there are also other specs outside of it. So it's not that if you have one group of specs within that CN4J working group, that they all need to be together at all time, at all costs. You have profiles, you have the different subsets. Everyone can choose and pick what they would like and want to combine.
Yeah, but that has to be a well-defined principle. And again, the issue is, as David is touching on, if there's a profile in EE that's incorporating specifications from other, subsets, call them sub-working groups or development sets, I think is what I call them in the current proposal. and they have different semantics with respect to compatibility requirements, lifecycle, all of that. I mean, how do you deal with that? And that's what's got to be defined. And that would be basically the purpose of that shared steering committee.
I think is if we put like similar technologies and closely related technologies together, in order to be able to utilize technologies, I mean, together as well. So the core basically need to be defined. So it's whatever comes to core. So this kind of this state is going to be like the central place of this cloud native group. Maybe that one, these kind of things need to be closely monitored and etc. All the others can be loosely coupled. Anyway, just thinking aloud.
Yeah, but that's pretty much along the lines of what I was saying with respect to you have to focus on what is the core. I don't see it could be anything else other than some set of existing EE APIs. But so, for example, let's say core config wants to be pulled in the core. I think that is, you have to change potentially the semantics if the core has different semantics relative to MicroProfile. Whether or not you need to change the name is another question. I mean, it could be dealt with two ways. You could leave it in the same package space, but you're still going to change the semantics of how that project evolves from that point forward, or you basically fork the spec.
Yeah, so if it's come to core, it need to have a special stamp.
Yeah, but is that not something natural for a spec or a thing that evolves? Because in the beginning, like it was also the idea of MicroProfile, we experiment, we try the best things out, but after a while, I hope that you have found what you are looking for and that you have settled with a certain solution. And that's a point where it becomes more or less fixed, and then it can be evolve, of course, but there is no major changes anymore, no breaking changes will be at a minimum. So that is something natural, I think, for every specification.
Yeah, I don't know if I'd include breaking changes in there because even mature specs have breaking changes. But I understand your broader point.
Yeah, but I mean, it's related again to, because to me, the sets of APIs that evolve or that would be candidates, you know, if you go and look at today's landscape of Java, I mean, it's frankly, you know, ridiculously large. I mean, there's too many opinions. And again, it was brought up that reactive, you know, didn't really become developed well under MicroProfile, and one of the people working on it kind of dropped off. But I mean, to me, that was more an indication that it was not a sufficiently mature technology relative to agreed upon implementations. You know, that's going to happen. So, you know, once you get to a point, it gets to enterprise level adoption, and people who are going to be running websites or want commitment contracts for, you know, multiple years, you know, that's where you have to have stabilization. And it's just an engineering effort. I mean, people don't want to spend the money to maintain arbitrary forks. So, I mean, they're going to participate in specifications that match their impedance requirements relative to customer support. I mean, that's, to me, what we've got to be considering, because that's the majority of our businesses.
So a spec that is defined in MicroProfile, I'm trying to read into this, and I'm providing a scenario for you, Scott, to kind of help me understand your perspective. If we have a spec in MicroProfile, like config, since it's already been discussed, could that be pulled into and used by a Jakarta, be added to the core Jakarta platform?
Sure. So the two fundamental questions are the ones that David's already asked. Do you fork that into a Jakarta namespace? And then essentially you're creating a fork of it. You're saying this now is a core specification in some EE platform, and it can continue to involve a MicroProfile under its namespace however it wants, even incompatibly, but in the future there's going to have to be some synchronization point. Or do you simply freeze it? Or you basically switch it to, I mean, essentially the Jakarta core specification process, because that's the life cycle and semantics it needs to adhere to, but it can keep the same package name. But then essentially it moves, I think it was what Emily's saying, from MicroProfile to Jakarta EE core, and it's a dependency on the MicroProfile project now, but no longer lives with the MicroProfile semantics.
So are those the only two options though? I mean, is there...
I'm sure you can have infinitely variety, but I mean, fine. I mean, people can come up with others, but what, again, my focus is you have two fundamental sets of customers. You have customers who are going to be able to deal with a more rapidly evolving subset relative to some new technology that's the latest hype, and then you have enterprise Java customers. And we have, that we've set expectations for them. They consume and upgrade much slower and have much longer support time life cycles. And that's how I'm looking at this. So again, we can certainly decide to change that and make these partitions different. But to me, that's the most fundamental partition between the EE core and anything else. Is there's an enterprise customer who's running a big business, or it's their business, it's what they care about, and they have certain expectations. And then there's people who are trying novel technologies because it's been promoted as the new way to do things.
So that's also similar to how I partition things as well, by the way. I think there are multiple user bases, I guess, if you want to call them use cases or actors, or however you want to define it. There are those who want something more stable, and those that do want fast moving. I think those are two different user bases. So sorry, Emily.
Sorry, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, go.
The other thing is like, in the MicroProfile we released quite rapidly. Like we could introduce this kind of long-term support. Basically, it's like we stable is like, okay, this release we keep whatever we have here, and then in the next release we do experiment mode, and then experiment mode, and then we do another release, we stabilize it. So for that kind of like a release, that can be widely adopted, and etc. And in this way, people can MicroProfile customers can continue use MicroProfile, and then they are aware, okay, whatever the new functionality in the long-term support might go away. And in this way, we freely still can support freely to do the backward incompatible changes. However, we'll be careful with a long-term release. And the customer don't need to repackage or change their package again from MicroProfile to Jakarta, and etc. Unnecessary changes.
Yeah, so I was hearing a comment, I think with John, but I don't see being, well, I see these two crowds, as you mentioned, but I don't see being stable and fast moving to be incompatible things. I think you can accomplish a thing that can actually serve those two audiences. And for instance, the sample with the LTS releases that Java is doing, I think it's a very good example on how Java as a language and as a core platform is evolving in a fast pace with the 6 month releases, but then you have a LTS release every 2 years for people that don't want to be on the edge all the time. So I think it's working very well for the Java core team. So why we just don't look into it and maybe try to figure out if that's something that we can adopt as well.
Sorry, you made a really good statement and I lost it. You said you don't see fast moving and something as being incompatible.
I don't see like stable and fast moving to be incompatible.
Taking notes here. And the interesting thing there is almost everyone's still on Java 8.
Yeah, I mean, that's the only concern I have is I don't think that that's had a sufficient roadmap to prove that that actually works. Because all I see is people sitting on the last LTS. And then right now people are planning to move to the next LTS, ignoring all other development. I mean, semantically, it's still effectively that you have two different projects. I mean, they happen to have the same developers, but they have completely different semantics. And I mean, you know, what's not being validated in that model right now is, are there things leaking from the interim releases that shouldn't have been in an LTS? I mean, that's my concern I have with that model is I don't know that that's, you know, completely consistent. I mean, we do use that. We use that as well on the Red Hat products, you know, but we know that we have our semantics enforced on that. So, I mean, that's the question is, what are the semantics of those interim fast-moving releases versus what goes into an LTS? I mean, so I agree that that's a pretty, that's a good, that could certainly be something to try.
So I think is, yeah, the difference for this LTS and etc. in the MicroProfile spec is because the runtime support them. Considering you have a customer base like Quarkus, we have Open Liberty and etc. Is the like have you seen the like customer trying to stay up to date with the latest release? And I mean, in the past, I haven't seen this trend, but last year, I mean, from my own experience and etc., I feel like a customer is trying to use the latest technologies. So people are trying to move up to like the latest, the long-term release of Java, like people gradually move to Java 11, etc.
Well, we have customers that are all over the map, and I mean, kind of the adoption of a more leading edge is kind of being enforced by cloud environments, frankly, you know, because that's the service, that's the support contract. If you're going to be in the cloud, you have to adopt to its release model, which tends to, you know, not support the traditional, you know, you can pay money and have an arbitrary time frame that all support this model. You know, there's too many customers and too many moving pieces. So I think the cloud is kind of forcing that, which is, you know, again, if we're focusing on the cloud, that's something we could adopt.
Right. Again, for this long-term support thing is we could pick like a config, for example, because we want it to be used by Jakarta. So that's the kind of one of the big use case. Like we say, okay, we are happy with the current config, and we make it a long-term support. Basically, we kind of don't want to introduce like backward incompatibility at ease. And then the Jakarta can depend on it. And then we can continue to like innovate and etc. to be used by MicroProfile. So I think it's a kind of serve a different audience.
I'll also remember that, and I mean, of course, this is not applied to everyone, but the trend of people moving to microservices just means that they're not building these big monoliths anymore that they have to build for like 2, 3, 4 years. Right, they'll be doing these small services that they build for like a couple of months or even a couple of weeks, and then when they have to start a new one, they just start from scratch and they can just pick the newest and latest all over again, and they're not forced to be on an old version because that's the one that they're using in the previous service that they have to maintain, right? So they can just keep upgrading and using new stuff all the time because they're building new services. They are working independently, right?
Yeah, very true, Roberto. It is really easy to upgrade to the latest as well. So
yes, it is. But a lot of companies are also saying, just as they say, oh, with each microservice you can use another language. that's a thing that they do not want anymore, because then you have too many things within your company that the knowledge about things are too fragmented. The same is happening with all those versions. If you have developers that needs to know 3 or 4 different versions of a certain framework, then that's also an issue. So that's also a thing that companies are starting to do, that they are limiting the number of versions that they are using.
Yeah, right. I mean, that's the issue. It's always a trade-off or conflict between supposed developer upfront productivity versus the actual operations cost.
Okay, so this time has flown by as the moderator guy who probably talked too much in this particular call. We've got like 8 minutes left. We got a couple of interesting ideas, like around maybe an LTS kind of thing we could hash out in the Google group. There's been some folks that are on the call that haven't had a chance to talk yet. If there's anyone else that would kind of like to throw out their thoughts around what we've discussed so far, that would be awesome.
There is a note on the chat about the number of people who raise their hands. So I don't know if we want to give more time for the people to catch up. I know we discussed briefly some of the topics, but my perception is that still not the majority was aware of what would trigger the discussion today.
Yeah, I just kind of posted that, John, just so that we kind of had a record, because I didn't know if a recording actually would record the votes.
Oh, but, good.
But you know, I just to get across that, you know, I don't think it was a wide, you know, definitely not the majority of people had read the material before the call, and I that was the point of just recording it.
Yeah, okay. I think a good to do from this meeting would be to go read through David's proposals, but think about them in the context of the LTS suggestion, because I do think that falls in between kind of what has been suggested. You said, what's an alternative between those two? Well, there's one. And as Robert mentioned, it's already, you know, that is a release cadence mechanism that other Java products are using. So I think that's a good thing to think about how that might work.
But that can be the same difficult question as when is a spec supposed to be final, stable enough? The same issue you will have is what will be in that LTS and which versions will be in that LTS.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's exactly what's going to come down to. But, you know, it does address, it basically answers the question as to whether or not you'd fork it into a Jakarta namespace. I would think with an LTS answer would be no, because you don't want to deal with the, you know, that necessary impedance mismatch, which really isn't adding anything other than supposedly changing the life cycle. You know, unless you're going to say that all LTS releases were under a Jakarta namespace and non-LTSs could potentially have alternate namespaces, which I think is too much complexity.
Yeah, I for one shy away heavily from forking namespaces, from any concept of a fork between the two, because here's the interesting thing. Even though we have these two different user bases, there's also overlap, right? So, you know, people want to take their code maybe and run it in both environments, right? Or easily move it between the two and stuff. So, I mean, I'm guessing that very few people on this call would want to have any notion of a fork.
Yeah, I definitely don't vote to fork. I think it's a sentence one project death is not a good thing. So I think it's the kind of, okay, we made one product, yeah, here you go, you can use it, and then we continue to make more, make something and improve it.
Well, so I think that gives a context to move a technical alignment forward, but that still leaves the question of, do those communities, so again, MicroProfile and EE, we still have issues with about how branding is used, TCKs are used, all that stuff. How would we? I think that's the next difficult conversation: is how does that get resolved?
So I apologize. Before I made a blanket statement, and I just want anyone that thinks this blanket statement is not true, let me know. I'm putting kind of in the notes here. There's no desire to fork between MicroProfile, fork specs between MicroProfile and Jakarta EE. Does anyone disagree with that, or have thoughts about that? Okay. No desire. That's not an answer, but there's no desire for it. Okay. Sorry, Scott, you kind of had your.
So, John.
Yeah.
So I got to ask though, what just to clarify that statement. So no desire to fork specs. So you mean to have them developed in both environments?
Good question.
Yeah, but what I meant by that is David's suggestion, where you have basically, again, let's take config. Config is moving in org MicroProfile to namespace. It does what it does via that MicroProfile spec process. It's decided that it should be me in the core of EE. At that point, it gets forked into a Jakarta namespace, and it basically runs under the JESP. That's what I meant by fork. But with the LTS, that can, that has there's a different approach potentially.
Okay. Because the basic definition of a fork is, okay, so we took config to a certain spot in its lifetime, and then we decided to contribute it to Jakarta, then yeah, that's still a fork though. So that movement would be okay, but I don't like the idea that we would be allowed to continue development of both technologies in both organizations.
Okay, well, that's a controlled fork, I guess. We'll call it that.
Okay. Yeah.
But, you can't really prevent it, right? It's a question of,
right. Right. So I just wanted to clarify that's what we were talking about when we say no desire to fork. Yeah. Okay. Good. Someone cleared that up there. Okay. I'm good.
So Ken, asked an interesting question. How much time do we have? Sorry. We're at the top of the hour, so let's continue this in the Google Groups. Thanks, everyone, for joining. I think we have this idea of an LTS release, or at least around technical alignment, to chat about in the Google Groups. Yes, we have lots of other things to discuss around, governance type things, for instance, but this is at least something for us to, I think, work off of, continuing the discussion, this notion of an LTS. So, all right, everyone. The next meeting is this time, same bat channels, same bat time, same bat channel. Next week, we'll reserve hopefully 30 minutes on that call and continue this cadence until we hopefully hit something. So hit an approach that we get consensus on. That would be nice. That's ideal. So, all right. Thanks, everyone, and see you in about a week.
Okay. Thanks. Bye.
Yep.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.